At 11:47 on the morning of December 20th, 1943, a lone American bomber limped across the German countryside at barely 200 feet. It should not have been flying at all. The aircraft was a B-17 Flying Fortress, but there was nothing fortress-like about it anymore. The nose was gone, torn away by flak. One engine was dead. Another streamed black smoke through holes ripped open along the fuselage. The tail section hung in shreds of metal and fabric, fluttering violently in the winter air. Inside the bomber, the crew were wounded, freezing, and barely conscious. Oxygen lines had been severed. Blood had frozen where it had splashed across bare aluminum. Several of the defensive guns were silent, not because the crew had chosen not to fire, but because the men who had manned them were already dead. The bomber was flying so low that farmhouses and treetops rushed past beneath its wings. It was alone. From a forward airfield nearby, a German fighter lifted into the sky. The pilot was Oberleutnant Franz Steigler, 28 years old, a veteran of North Africa and Sicily, and one of the Luftwaffe's most capable fighter pilots. Earlier that morning, he had already shot down 2 American bombers. One more would earn him the Knight's Cross, the most coveted decoration in the German armed forces. As Stigler climbed, he saw the crippled B-17 crossing directly over his airfield. This was the easiest kill of his career. The bomber could not maneuver. It could not defend itself. Its gunners were either wounded or dead. A single burst of cannon fire into the engines or cockpit would send it crashing into the fields below. Stigler moved into position behind the bomber, his guns aligned, his finger resting on the trigger. He had made this approach dozens of times before. And then he hesitated. As he closed the distance, he could see inside the aircraft. Through the torn fuselage, he saw the slumped body of the tail gunner, still strapped into his position. He saw wounded men struggling to tend to each other. He saw blood, ice, and exhaustion etched into every movement. These were not faceless enemies. They were helpless men trying to stay alive. In that moment, with victory and honor within reach, Franz Stigler faced a choice that no training manual could prepare him for. To understand why he did not fire, to understand why this moment would remain a secret for nearly half a century, we need to understand what American bomber crews were facing in 1943. And we need to understand what the German pilots watching them were beginning to realize. In 1943, flying with the 8th Air Force meant confronting a simple mathematical truth. Most men would not survive their tour. American bomber crews were required to complete 25 combat missions before they could return home. On paper, the average loss rate hovered around 4% per mission. The arithmetic was merciless. Each flight into Germany carried a growing certainty that chance alone would eventually catch up with you. The crews understood this. They talked about it openly in barracks and briefing rooms. One phrase circulated again and again among the men of the 8th Air Force. Flying bomber missions, they said, was like holding a ticket to a funeral, your own. By the summer and fall of 1943, the losses were catastrophic. In October alone, during what became known as Black Week, the 8th Air Force lost 148 heavy bombers in just 7 days. Nearly 1,500 airmen were killed or captured. Entire crews vanished in minutes. The men climbing into B-17s and B-24s each morning could do the math. Most never made it past their 5th mission. And yet, every day, they climbed aboard again. Once airborne, there was no illusion about what awaited them. The bomber formations flew straight and level, locked into rigid combat boxes. They could not weave. They could not dive. Any sudden maneuver would tear the formation apart and expose every aircraft to immediate destruction. Flying a bomber over Germany meant committing to the path, no matter what happened. German anti-aircraft fire turned the sky into a solid wall of explosions. Hundreds of flak guns filled the air with timed bursts, ripping metal and flesh apart. A direct hit destroyed an aircraft instantly. A near miss could shred control surfaces, rupture fuel tanks, or kill crewmen where they stood. Then came the fighters. German pilots waited patiently until American escort fighters reached the limit of their fuel range and turned back. Only then did the attacks begin. Bf-109s and FW-190s slashed into the formations from every direction. They attacked from the front, where the bombers' defenses were weakest. They attacked from below, where the ball turrets struggled to track them. They attacked in pairs, in groups, in waves. The bomber crews called this stretch of the mission the Gauntlet. From the moment they crossed the German border until they turned for home, they were under constant assault. The German fighters rotated. When one pilot ran low on fuel or ammunition, another replaced him. The bombers had no such relief. They flew on, straight through the fire, watching aircraft around them explode and fall away. Inside the bombers, the strain was crushing. Flight surgeons documented the symptoms: shaking hands, sleeplessness, sudden rage followed by silence. Men who had been confident on their first mission became hollow-eyed by their 10th. And still, they held formation. What the American crews did not fully realize was that they were not facing an enemy blind to their suffering. German pilots saw everything. They saw bombers continue their runs even after losing engines. They saw formations close ranks around damaged aircraft. They saw crews fly straight through flak storms without braking, even when survival made no sense on paper. The Germans had expected the Americans to crack under sustained losses. They did not. Day after day, the bombers came back, not fewer of them, but more. Larger formations, tighter discipline, unyielding persistence. From German cockpits, something unexpected was taking shape. Not hatred, not contempt, something closer to respect. The German pilots who rose to intercept American bombers in 1943 were not inexperienced men rushed into battle. They were, in many cases, the most seasoned fighter pilots in the world. Some had been flying combat missions since the Spanish Civil War. Others had fought over Poland, France, and Britain. Many had survived years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front. They were confident, aggressive, and accustomed to winning. The Luftwaffe they belonged to had defeated every air force it had faced. When the Americans arrived in force, German pilots expected the same outcome. Instead, they encountered something they had not anticipated. The first time many German pilots saw an American bomber formation, they were struck by its sheer scale. Hundreds of heavy aircraft flying in precise alignment, bristling with machine guns, pressing steadily forward despite losses that would have shattered other air forces. This was not recklessness, it was discipline. The bombers did not scatter when attacked. They did not break formation when flak tore holes through their ranks. Damaged aircraft were absorbed into tighter defensive boxes, protected by the surrounding crews. From German cockpits, this was impossible to ignore. Johannes Steinhoff, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots, later spoke openly about the impression American crews made. He had flown hundreds of combat missions against British and Soviet aircraft before ever facing the Americans. What he saw over Germany was different. The Americans kept coming. They flew into the most heavily defended airspace in the world day after day, knowing the odds. They flew straight and level through flak barrages that killed men without warning. And when German fighters dove directly at their cockpits in head-on attacks, they did not flinch. These attacks demanded courage from both sides. A head-on pass closed at a combined speed approaching 600 miles per hour. The German pilot had barely 2 seconds to aim, fire, and break away. A fraction of a second too late, and both aircraft would collide in a blinding flash. The German pilots knew what this required, and so did the men holding their course inside the bombers. This recognition created a strange tension in the air war. German pilots were professional soldiers, trained to destroy the enemy without hesitation, but many could not help noticing that the Americans they were killing were not panicked or careless. They were resolute. There was also a line that still mattered. Among experienced Luftwaffe pilots, certain rules were understood without being written down. Shooting a man in a parachute was forbidden. Killing a helpless enemy was not combat. It was murder. These rules did not always hold. War erodes boundaries. But in 1943, among veteran pilots, the distinction still existed, and it weighed heavily on men who had spent years in the air. German pilots began to speak of American airmen not as faceless enemies, but as dangerous opponents who had earned respect through endurance alone. Not because they were winning, but because they refused to stop fighting even when defeat seemed inevitable. What none of them could yet see was that this respect would soon be overtaken by something else. American courage was about to be matched by American capability, and when that happened, The balance in the sky would shift forever. By late 1943, German fighter pilots still believed they could win the air war. They respected American courage, but respect was not fear. The Luftwaffe still held advantages: experience, tactics, and the belief that time was on their side. If the Americans continued to lose bombers at the current rate, their offensive would collapse under its own weight. Then, slowly at first, the sky began to change. American long-range escort fighters had existed before. The P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning could protect bombers part of the way into Germany, but their range was limited. German pilots had learned to wait. Once the escorts turned back, the bombers were exposed. That certainty ended with the arrival of a new aircraft, the P-51 Mustang. At first, German pilots noticed something unsettling. American fighters were appearing deeper over Germany than ever before. They were still there over the target, still there on the return flight, still there when the bombers crossed back over the German border. The Mustang could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and all the way home. It was fast, agile, and deadly. Powered by a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the P-51 could climb higher, dive faster, and fight on equal terms with anything the Luftwaffe put into the air. With external fuel tanks, its range was unprecedented. For the first time, German pilots could no longer choose when to fight. The change became absolute in January 1944, when General Jimmy Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force. Doolittle made a decision that stunned both sides. American fighters were no longer ordered to stay close to the bombers at all times. Instead, they were released to hunt. Mustang groups swept ahead of the bomber streams, searching for German fighters. After the bombers struck their targets, American pilots dropped to low altitude and attacked Luftwaffe airfields directly. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Pilots were killed before they could even take off. There was no safe airspace anymore. For German pilots, the psychological shift was immediate and brutal. They were no longer hunters waiting for their moment. They were being hunted, constantly. In February 1944, the change reached its peak during Operation Argument, known as Big Week. For 6 days, American and British forces launched an all-out assault on German aircraft production. Nearly 1,000 bombers struck factories across the Reich, while hundreds of fighters roamed freely overhead. By day, American bombers hit assembly plants. By night, British bombers returned to the same targets. German industry suffered, but it survived. German pilots did not. During Big Week, the Luftwaffe lost nearly a fifth of its experienced fighter pilots. These were not easily replaced men. They were veterans with years of combat knowledge, men who understood how to read the sky, when to attack and when to disengage. Each one lost took irreplaceable experience with him. As the losses mounted, the system began to collapse. Before the war, German fighter pilots received over 250 hours of flight training. By early 1944, that number had dropped sharply. By summer, new pilots arrived at frontline units with barely 100 hours. Some had less. They were sent into combat against American pilots who had trained for nearly 400 hours, many of them flying the same aircraft type they would take into battle. The results were catastrophic. New German pilots died on their first missions. Some were shot down before firing a single round. Veterans watched their replacements disappear one by one, knowing there was nothing they could do to save them. Courage could not compensate for experience. By mid-1944, German pilots no longer spoke of American courage. They spoke of inevitability. The Americans did not just absorb losses. They learned. They adapted. They improved tactics, coordination, and training at a pace Germany could not match. Every month, the gap widened. The Luftwaffe that had once ruled the skies was bleeding itself to death. And still, the bombers came. When Franz Stiegler closed in on the damaged B-17, he expected to finish the mission quickly. Instead, he slowed. From barely 50 meters away, he could see into the aircraft as clearly as if it were on the ground. The tail section was destroyed. The gun was silent. The gunner sat motionless, slumped forward, still strapped into his harness. Inside the fuselage, wounded men struggled to move. One crawled across the floor, slipping in blood and hydraulic fluid, trying to reach another crewman. There was no return fire, no resistance, only exhaustion and shock. Stigler had been trained from his first days as a fighter pilot to destroy the enemy without hesitation. He had done so many times before, but he had also been taught something else by his former commander, Gustav Rödel. "You fight with honor," Rödel had told him. "You do not shoot parachutes. You do not kill helpless men." Looking at the crippled bomber, Stigler understood that this was no longer a fight. It was an execution. His guns were still aligned. One squeeze of the trigger would secure his third victory of the day. The Knight's Cross would follow. His name would be written into official reports. No one would question the kill. But he could not fire. Instead, Stigler pulled his fighter alongside the bomber's left wing. Inside the B-17, the American pilot, Charlie Brown, could hardly believe what he was seeing. A German fighter flew close enough that he could see the pilot's face. For a moment, Brown was certain they were about to die. Then the German pilot began making hand gestures. He pointed downward. "Land." Brown shook his head. The bomber could not make it to an airfield. The German pilot pointed again, this time to the east. "Surrender." Brown refused. He kept flying. Then the German pilot pointed north, toward the North Sea, toward neutral Sweden. For several long seconds, the two aircraft flew side by side. No shots were fired, no words were exchanged, only the roar of engines and the bitter cold of high-altitude air. Stigler realized that if German flak crews saw the B-17, they would destroy it instantly. So he stayed. He positioned his fighter between the bomber and the ground, flying close enough that anti-aircraft gunners would hesitate, unsure of what they were seeing. He escorted the American aircraft past gun batteries, past radar stations, past the last line of German defenses. Only when the bomber reached open water did Stigler peel away. Before turning back, he raised his hand in a brief salute. Brown watched the German fighter disappear. Neither man spoke of the incident for decades. Both understood that if it became known, one would face court-martial, the other interrogation. The war demanded obedience, but on that winter morning, obedience had lost its hold. The B-17 made it back to England. Against every expectation, Charlie Brown and what remained of his crew survived the crossing. When they landed, intelligence officers questioned them immediately. They were told never to speak of the German fighter that had escorted them to safety. The war left no room for such stories. Franz Stigler also remained silent. He told no one, not his comrades, not his superiors. He continued flying combat missions until the war's end, carrying the memory with him alone. Had his actions been discovered, the consequences would have been severe. Both men returned to civilian life after the war ended. Brown resumed a quiet life in the United States. Stigler emigrated to Canada. Decades passed, the world changed, but the memory of that winter morning never faded. In the late 1980s, Charlie Brown began searching for the German pilot who had spared his crew. He placed notices in pilot newsletters, describing the encounter in careful detail, unsure if anyone would respond. One day, a letter arrived. Franz Stigler had read the description and knew immediately who had written it. When the two men finally met, more than 40 years after the war, there was no bitterness between them. They spoke not as former enemies, but as men who had shared a moment that defied everything around it. They became friends. Their families met. They attended events together. Brown would later say that Stigler had been as close as a brother to him. 9 lives had been spared that day over Germany. Those men went on to build families, careers, and futures that would never have existed otherwise. The air war over Europe was brutal, necessary, and unforgiving. It destroyed cities, machines, and millions of lives. It demanded obedience and punished hesitation. Yet even in that environment, a single choice proved that humanity had not vanished entirely. The Luftwaffe lost the war in the skies over Europe, but on one winter morning in 1943, a German pilot refused to lose himself.